and very important one. The honourable member, resuming debate, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to contribute to the debate about changes to the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and I want to start by stating again our full support for Ukraine in the war against Russia that started with an illegal and unjustified invasion of Ukrainian territory last year in February, not only in response to some of the atrocities committed by Russian forces in the region, but also as a firm stance in favor of international law and a rules-based order that Ukrainians are on the front, very literally on the front line of today. And I think it's important that we, when we choose our allies, that we choose allies who are committed to those values and to the application of international law, and that we hold our allies to high standards when it comes to their observance of international law in what they do. And so there are many ways that you can support allies, and of course Canada has sent various kinds of aid, whether financial or military, to Ukraine, but also being a helpful trading partner in times of strife is also something that's important. And so, you know, what I would say is that at the high level, while we're very committed as New Democrats to supporting Ukraine, details do matter. And that's why there are established procedures for the House and departmental guidelines for ensuring that parliamentarians have time to do their job of proper scrutiny, because we know that sometimes, under the auspices of good causes, governments have been known to sneak a few things in. And that's why the department's own policy on tabling treaties in the House of Commons requires 21 sitting days between the tabling of the text of the treaty and the tabling of enabling legislation. And given that the text of the treaty was tabled on October 17th, just a few days ago, normally that would mean that we wouldn't be seeing enabling legislation until November 22nd, but instead it has come much quickly. It's about a week since the text of the treaty was tabled, and we find ourselves in the second day of debate. So that's in contravention of the department's own guidelines on tabling treaties in Parliament. That's a document that, as New Democrats, we take very seriously because we take the work of this place seriously. One of the practical consequences of that, Madam Speaker, is that even though we're on the second day of debate for changes to an international trade treaty, caucuses have not had the opportunity to meet since this was tabled. And so it's a very tight turnaround when you're talking about a large document with some important implications. To ask parliamentarians to be speaking with authority to such a large document, as I say, with a lot of detail on just a few days turnaround, does not manifest in spirit, and in this case not even in letter, the government's words about taking Parliament seriously as part of the trade process. So I think that's an important thing for Canadians to know and to understand, and we often in this place, there are debates that touch upon the role of Parliament and the seriousness with which government takes Parliament. And I think this is one of those examples. These are the times, not because it's a big controversial thing, precisely because it's not. And we know that the government had signed this treaty well before it was tabled in the House of Commons. There were opportunities to bring Parliament into the loop and to follow the appropriate policy. And for whatever reason, the government chose to take a pass on that, as they too often have in the past. So for those in government who mean it when they say that they take this place seriously, we would exhort them to talk to their colleagues in cabinet to make sure that they are following at the very least, the established procedures for conducting these kinds of debates and discussions in the House of Commons. And when they get good at least following through on their own commitments and their own established policies, then we can talk about how to do it better, because there certainly are ways to do it better, ways that involve the legislature much earlier on in the process and build a tighter mandate for enabling legislation when it hits the floor of the House. There's been a lot of talk already about some of the language in this agreement, and I thank the previous speaker for having pointed out that flowery language in preambles and elsewhere, if they're not accompanied by proper enforcement mechanisms that have teeth that would catch the attention either of our own government or the governments into which we're entering treaties, the flowery language doesn't really amount to much. So I'm going to lay out what I think is a small but symbolic test of the government's commitment, not just on its process for trade treaties, but also in the context of this particular one and some of the flowery language. There's talk about an Indigenous chapter and Indigenous rights. I know that the government also had flowery language on that file when it came to the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. But when I moved an amendment to the enabling legislation that would be a non-derogation clause for Indigenous rights, which just said nothing in that legislation, nothing in the agreement would impede upon the already established rights of Indigenous people in Canada, I watched the Liberals vote with Conservatives not to have such a clause. Just a reminder that Indigenous people do have rights in this country, and that nothing that this government does in the context of an international trade treaty can undermine that or take away some of those existing rights. And I was disappointed at the reticence of members in the government to endorse that as a basic principle and to put it in the legislation. Now we see flowery language about Indigenous rights. Let's be sure that at a minimum, we're including that non-derogation clause in this enabling legislation. I think that's an important point. I do want to take some time, with the time I have remaining, Madam Speaker, just to talk a little bit about one of the issues that I know certain Conservative colleagues have raised in respect of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and since the war began, more largely about the supply of Canadian oil and gas to Ukraine. What I want to point out, Madam Speaker, regardless of whether you're someone who supports more natural gas and oil development in Canada for export to Ukraine or not, is that when Conservatives talk about this, what they're implying is that we should have a greater role for government in deciding who the customers of Canadian oil and gas companies are. Now, that's not something that I find particularly offensive in principle. I think that is a conversation we should be having. We should talk about what a reasonable level of extraction for oil and gas, barrels per day, barrels per year is. And we should have a conversation about the best way to use those finite resources. Finite because they're not renewable resources. Finite because if we're doing it right, we should have some kind of cap on how much extraction can happen in a year that is devised with our climate commitments in mind. And oil and gas becomes a very precious resource indeed, as Canadians already know, with the prices that they're being forced to pay. The Conservatives would have you believe because of a carbon tax, but in fact, if you look at the record profits that oil and gas companies have been experiencing over the last number of years, price gouging actually is a much bigger concern, or should be a bigger concern, for Canadians, because whatever government is taking in the form of the carbon tax and delivering back to Canadians in the form of a rebate is a hell of a lot less than what oil and gas companies are taking out of their pocket and sending off into international tax havens. That's costing Canadians a heck of a lot more. But it's rich for the Conservatives to get up and pretend that somehow they're in support of talking about how a public regulatory framework could guide export relationships and contracts for the oil and gas industry. That's not something that they support. Yes, they support getting more oil and gas out of the ground faster. Yes, they support those companies selling it wherever they can make the best buck. But for the government to get involved and actually say we should not be buying oil and gas from these countries, we should be exporting oil and gas to those countries, invites a lot more public involvement in the oil and gas industry than I think they have the stomach for. So that's a debate that I welcome. I think that is something that from many perspectives we should be talking about, the best, most efficient and prosperous use of finite oil and gas resources. But I don't believe that that's a conversation they're serious about having. I think in contexts like this, they use it to score cheap political points, and Canadians should pay attention and not take them at their word on this.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to address the member's opening comments. We need to put it in the perspective of that this is an agreement that was actually signed off on just last month between the Prime Minister and the President. And now we have before us the legislation, which was done in a relatively quick fashion. And what we have to put it in the perspective of, or the context of, is the fact that we have an illegal invasion by Russia into Ukraine, a time of war when allied countries around the world, and there's this huge sense of Ukrainian solidarity coming to support Ukraine, and Canada being the first country to actually enter into a trade agreement, even at a time of war. It's there not only for the economic benefits of both Canada and Ukraine, but it also sends the right type of messaging to the people of Ukraine and Russia. And his thoughts on that.
Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Well, I mean, it's true that it was signed off just last month when President Zelensky visited Ottawa, but our understanding is that, in fact, the terms and conditions of that agreement were finalized much sooner. And I think it's important for members of the government not to confuse their own communications imperatives and their desire to have nice press conferences and fancy signing ceremonies with the imperatives of a war. I think that does a disservice. It seems to me that actually the agreement was in a position to be signed sooner, and then they could have followed their own policy and had the legislation in Parliament sooner, and we can honor the imperatives of the war without taking seriously the government's own communication strategy.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I enjoyed the member's speech. However, it did concern me that he was somewhat disparaging towards our oil and gas industry. You know, he accused some in this House of scoring cheap political points. But when you do that, you better not be guilty of doing the very same thing. And unfortunately, he is the guilty one here. I would say this, though. Natural gas is one of the solutions to the world's GHG, greenhouse gas emission challenges. We can displace dirty coal elsewhere around the world by exporting much cleaner natural gas to those countries. There's some urgency in doing this for Ukraine. And I would ask this member, does he not believe that Canada should put in place every single strategy that's available to us in order to get our liquefied natural gas to a country like Ukraine that is in such deep straits, that is in such turmoil because of Russia's invasion? Does he not agree that this is an urgent situation where we should be providing?
Allow him time to respond, and another question after that. The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm very happy to repeat myself. I've said that that actually is a conversation that I'm open to, but the member just did the very thing that I warn against, which is he talks about Canada could be sending oil and gas to countries that currently are burning coal. Fair enough. This is to talk about the government selecting places in the world where we think we have a strategic best use for our own oil and gas reserves. Fine, let's have that conversation, but I don't think that's a conversation Conservatives really want to have, because they actually want a free market in oil and gas. They're not interested in having that kind of government intervention. And I think it's telling that he found my comments, which were disparaging not of the oil and gas sector in this case, but of the Conservative Party. He conflated my critique of the Conservative Party with a critique of the industry. I think it's telling that they feel those two things are so closely tied at the hip.
Le temps pour une brève question. Alberni.
Thank my colleague, Madam Speaker, for her speech. And I just want to go back to the oil and gas. And we in this place, we continue to see the Conservatives try to focus on a diversion. They talk about the carbon tax. Last year it went up 2 cents. But oil and gas profits went up 18 cents on every liter of gas. And they don't talk about that, Madam Speaker, because we don't need oil and gas lobbyists here on Parliament Hill when we've got the Conservative Party right here in the House of Commons. But Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask through you, Madam Speaker, about the true cost of oil and gas not paying an excess profit tax right now, the impact that has on the economy and how that does apply to trade agreements when we look at how big corporations are getting off the hook when it comes to not paying their fair share in countries like Canada and Ukraine.
Brief answer from the member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I want to thank my colleague from Courtenay Alberni for highlighting once again the incredible impact that outsized profits in the oil and gas sector have been having on Canadian household budgets. And I would say also that, often one of the ways that their lobbyists in the Conservative Party like to defend that is to say, well, you can't help a wage earner without helping the wage payer. But these guys don't need help. They're making money hand over fist. And not only are they making money hand over fist, but after the last Alberta election, they turned around and laid 1,500 employees off, even though they were making more money than ever before.